Perfect. Great. So with that, we shall kick off. And let me just share my screen. Okay, and then let me put in slideshow mode. Okay. Do you see my presentation in slideshow mode?
Yes.
Perfect. Great. So, welcome everyone. So I will be delivering a talk on the effectiveness on the PQRST method for students with dyslexia. So for those who are watching on demand on YouTube, my name is basically Dr. Mitchell. I am the co-founder of this charity, M2 Sped Awareness, and I'm also in charge of projects and mentorings and teaching days like conference days and CPD days as well. I do have a background as a doctor and also as a clinical educator, so I'm really interested in terms of neuro-inclusivity in higher education. So before I go through the intended learning outcomes, which is a key feature of my talks, I always like to have a little bit of a reflection before the intended learning outcomes. So I'd like you all to close your eyes and I'd like you all to think about the last or current time that you are or you were in school. I want you to take a moment to think about your study technique with the following questions. Do you do any pre-reading before your lessons? Do you look at the syllabus or the intended learning outcomes? And if so, how do you use them? How do you write your notes? Do you test yourself? And how often do you test yourself? Okay, you may open your eyes. So I want you to always basically think about what you've been reflecting about here, because when we cover the PQRST method, you can compare how similar your method is towards the PQRST method. So now we go into the intended learning outcomes. So hopefully by the end of this talk, we should be able to define the PQRST method of studying. We should be able to summarize the findings from a study by Fabrianti. Yes, I've pronounced it correctly. Yes, go me. Not that I've been searching on Google how to pronounce it before the session. Looking into the effectiveness of the PQRST method and social group discussions and reading comprehension. And then we'll be applying this to how students with dyslexia can utilize this method, essentially. So in terms of the PQRST method, let's start off with a bit of a pre-knowledge check. So if you've ever heard of the PQRST method before, please raise your hands. This gives me a good gauge of basically how far to go with my explanations for the PQRST method in today's conference. Okay, so 1, okay, great, okay. Cool. So, Bilal, a bit of a challenge for you. Do you know what each letter stands for? And it's okay if you don't.
Just like to answer instead of typing.
Yeah, you can answer. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So honestly, I have no idea because I'm fairly new to this world, to be honest. But if I have to guess, does it have, I guess it's something like medical, so you have something to do with prior questioning, or I thought it was something learning, but there's no L, so maybe T for teaching.
Okay.
Honestly,
Interesting.
I guess that's that's what I was, that's what I'm guessing.
No, thank you for volunteering an answer. It just helps me really know where to pitch the explanation for the PQRST method today. Okay, so good. I'm looking forward to basically teaching you all something new then. So in terms of P is basically for preview or pre-read, as some other theorists may say. So in terms of preview, pre can be either discussed as a pre-read phase or a skim read phase, depending on which material you use. So if you're essentially studying from books, essentially you do not read basically the whole chapter and try and process the whole chapter. It's basically skim reading. So essentially you read the chapter introduction, And you essentially look at the headings, essentially, which is useful for when we come onto questions later and how you can use headings as questions. Then you essentially read the section introduction to have a basic feel of what the chapter is about. And then you basically move from text brain to essentially visual brain and diagrammatic brain by essentially looking at the diagrams and the figures that are essentially okay. So essentially, you do not read the body of the book at any shape or form when you're basically doing this. You're just focusing on introductions, pictures, and a conclusion. Um, that's basically books. If you've got lesson slides or lecture slides, this is where you use the learning objectives to your advantage. As a big fan of basically how older people learn, one of the main things that is said about how older people learn is basically goal-driven learning. As you basically enter sixth form or college and you go to university or even in the working world, if there isn't basically a goal, it's basically hard to stay motivated and know what you're basically doing. So it's really, really important to essentially use your learn objectives to basically be your goals, where you essentially read the slides with those learned objectives in mind. Then this is when you can write down questions about anything that you're unsure about that you hope will be addressed in the lecture. And this is really good because in my experience of working in the university, one of the common questions that I have for students is how do I actually utilize lectures well? And that's the thing. If you've basically pre-read and you've got some questions that you can think about in the lecture, that is the lecturer answering or not, that will help you basically fulfill that goal-driven learning. And at the end, basically have the confidence to go up to the lecturer or email the lecturer and basically say, I still have these questions that are answered from my pre-reading and the lecture. Can you answer this for me? So it makes basically going to classrooms and lectures a much more useful experience. Next, we move on to one of my two favorite phases, which is essentially the question phase. And this could be interpreted in two ways. Those who have had teaching sessions before will know that I am obsessed with ending my sessions with, what is one thing you've learned today? Because I believe in the school philosophy that if you've come in and you've only learned one thing, you've learned one more than nothing, essentially. And that should basically be really valued, essentially. And you can also use that to think about what further questions have you have that have been unanswered, which links to the preview, essentially. Interpretation B, which is my personal favorite, is essentially designing your own questions. And this could be done either by using the headings of a book to basically turn into questions, or you can use the learning objectives to basically turn into questions that you can use to test yourself later, essentially. Then the read phase can be interpreted in several ways depending on the material. So if it's a class or lecture, you basically go to the class or the lecture and you sit in it, for better or for worse. You lose concentration now and again, but you pray that you've learned at least one thing which is valuable. And then essentially you see if it's addressed your pre-planned questions or not. If it's a book, that's when you basically read fully. And this is where you have to link with your bricks of pre-knowledge. As we get older, we've learned a lot of topics from before that we can link to new topics. And it's about scaffolding your knowledge like a building from the bricks that you have to essentially make sure you embed and appreciate the information better. And also highlighters and underlining can be useful as well. So that's the reading phase. So next we move on to the summarize phase. So this is the bit where most difficulty can be had in terms of the PQRST method. It's important that you're still challenging yourself when you're basically doing summary. This is where you should close your books or your lecture notes or your class notes and essentially based on your cognitive diversity preference. So if you're more verbal, you're more visual, or you're more linguistic, basically summarize without referring to your reading material or your class or lecture notes. And essentially, when you're done, open it and basically fill in the bits you've missed. This basically helps to reduce the risk of you just copying down what is basically in the notes, because theory has suggested that if you're just passively copying down, you're not going to process much of the information at all. And then we move on to my favorite phase, which is testing. So when everything is tried and done, you basically test yourself either with your created questions from the learning outcomes or the headings of a book. You can also use AI as well. So if you do have PDF copies of your books or your class materials or your lecture notes, you can upload it to various AI websites that are able to generate questions for you that can test the material of your learning. And also, you can, if available, you can use question banks as well to test your knowledge. And anything that is basically still missing, you can review again. So that is the PQRST method. I've given you a lot of information. So to see whether you've processed a bit of it, at least one thing from it, we're going to basically test your knowledge. So I'm just going to pick random people from the Teams call to basically answer what each letter is associated with. So P, I'm going to pick Bilal. What is P? And
So P is for preview. So like it's basically when, for example, I mean, you use the example of a book or lecture or like a slide. It could be also like, for example, let's say a movie could be like, the trailer, for example. Basically,
so
you look
true.
at, like, have a preview. You have like
Yeah.
basically like an idea of what the main thing is without going into details. So you have the general picture of it.
Indeed, very much so. Thank you very much. Q, I'm going to go for Emily.
I don't think
for Q.
Sorry.
Yep. Okay, I think I can hear you now, Emily. Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Q for questioning.
Correct. Indeed. Thank you very much. R, we're going for Brian.
Read and understanding how to react to what you've just read.
Indeed. Very much so. Thank you very much. S, Mohammed.
If I'm not mistaken, it should be summarized.
Yes, you're not mistaken indeed. Thank you very much, Mohammed. And T, Kazim.
Apologies, I joined like right towards the end when you were explaining it, but I guess I'll just take a guess.
Mm-hmm.
Timing? I don't know.
No, not quite. Let's see if someone can help you out. Is Leah in the call?
Yes.
Yep. Yes, I can just about hear you. Yep.
Test.
Yep, test indeed. Good. So it looks like you've pretty much, as a cohort, processed PQRST pretty well. So well done to yourselves. If you can unmute and give a round of applause to yourselves. Great. So now that we've talked about PQRST, let's actually put it into context of a study by Fabrianti, which was done in 2018. Such a cool name. So in terms of the study, it compares the effectiveness of the PQRST against small group discussions. I'm a big, in the university I work at, we basically are very invested in small group learning and peer collaborative learning because it basically models what you do in real life in the workplace. Your peers are an effective resource, and when you go into the working world, you do basically go to your peers for support. The peers can be used as an effective resource in terms of learning and developing your knowledge, which is reflective of the adult working world, where when you're basically working, you basically can depend on your peers for support in terms of seeking information. It's not all the time you always seek the manager, essentially. So this helps sort of model that skill in terms of development, essentially. So in terms of sample, it involves second semester students from a university in Indonesia. However, we do not know the sample size nor the sex distribution. Why is it important to know the sample size or sex distribution? And I will accept raised hands for this question. I'll go with Bilal. Yes, Bilal?
I mean, for the sample size, because if you have like a small size, so let's say you only question 10 people, it's not relevant to the to the most populated, to the big population. So let's say you question 10 people who, let's say, from a specific area, and they all have whatever you are researching. But in reality, it might not be present in the whole population. So there's an element of bias in that.
Exactly, yes.
And same thing with the gender. So imagine you only test it on one gender. The thing could be different on the other gender. So
exactly.
Again, the reasons might not be viable.
Exactly. So reliability and bias is pretty much a concern with this particular study because we don't know that information. Thank you very much. So the method was that it was a quasi-experimental design. What that basically means is that the participants were not randomized. So if it was known which group they'll be allocated to. So one group was solely taught using the PQRST method, and the other was solely taught using the small group discussion method. It is a highly reliable test with a very high Combrac alpha. That's a very, very high score. So it is a very reliable test where essentially your comprehension of the material was measured at the start of your first session and at the end of your 8th session. The average score was then taken from each group, and it was essentially found that with the methods, there was no general difference between the general comprehension or reading to learn from text or integrating the information. However, small group discussion was effective for finding general information, and because as I'll say again, your peers have an effective resource in terms of finding information, essentially. However, the PQRST method is effective for skim reading, which is valuable, especially when we talk about neurodivergence and dyslexia, and also for finding simple information as well. So now that I've basically told you these study findings, it's time to actually focus on the brevity, well, the actual context of the session itself, which is dyslexia. But first, before we connect PQRST to dyslexia, let's actually have a bit of a general recap over what dyslexia is in terms of strengths and difficulties. We'll be doing strengths and difficulties because like neurotypical individuals have strengths and difficulties. You don't need the label of neurodivergence to have strengths and difficulties, but let's take into consideration common strengths and difficulties with dyslexia. So I will select. So Benjamin, if you can give me a strength of dyslexia.
I believe, I'm trying to remember now, one of the strengths of dyslexia is, I think, isn't it they're very creative?
Yep, so creativity, yes, indeed, great, especially with the visual spatialness. Okay, and Rose, I don't know if your mic is working. If not, you can put this in the chat. But what is a difficulty that's associated with dyslexia?
I'm not sure if I'm getting this mixed up, but is one difficulty like struggling to pay attention or like keeping at one task?
Yes and no. So there could be difficulty with sustaining attention, which can have an influence on comprehension difficulties. So a yes and a no. ADHD is quite comorbid with dyslexia, so that could have a mixed picture in terms of a potential difficulty indeed. Good, thank you for bringing this particular point forward. Great. So, in terms of going through the traits and epidemiology of dyslexia, so if there are 65 million people in the UK on average, that means 6.5 million people alone have an official diagnosis of dyslexia. This does not take into consideration those who haven't been diagnosed, which is actually quite extensive in the adult population, especially if they've never been to university before. In terms of common difficulties, there may be difficulties in terms of reading speed. There may be difficulties with written or verbal or both comprehension. So to put this into context, let's say in the average neurotypical individual read a paragraph from a book. It may take them 2 reads to process 2/3 of that paragraph from a book, but for the average dyslexic, it may take them 5 to 7 rereads to process 2/3 from that book. There may be spelling or grammar and or note-taking difficulties as well. But in terms of strengths, including creativity, they can be conceptualized thinkers, and people with dyslexia could have contextual memorization, a talent for memorizing stories, which is a beautiful gift, if I say so myself. The key thing is that no 2 people with dyslexia are the same. So that's why we say common and some, because no 2 people with dyslexia are the same. Like autism, dyslexia, and other neurodivergent groups exist on a spectrum. So let's now apply what we've covered in the session to basically students with dyslexia and how the PQRST method could benefit them. So, Eman, if you had to think about one way the PQRST method could be beneficial for students with dyslexia, what would you say?
I think it's because you're exposed to the material more than once. That would allow them to understand better.
Indeed, very much so. So because you're basically processing that same information, like 5 stages, pretty much, you're going through the same material in 5 stages. That basically enhances processing of information. Thank you very much, Eman. Tahir, are you in the call? If so, do you have any suggestions?
They said their mic isn't working.
Okay, that's fine. And has he put anything else in the chat?
Not yet. I'm just watching the chat. Oh, he's typing now.
Okay, cool. In the meantime, I will basically Yep.
He's asking what was the question again?
So how could the PQRST method be useful for students with dyslexia?
Thank you.
You're welcome. And in the meantime, I'll ask Mohammed for any suggestions.
Well, so the PQRST will help dyslexic students because the P, which is preview, it can help them decode long passages. Previewing the material allows them to get an overview without feeling overwhelmed.
Yes, indeed.
And
yes.
the Q question bit could encourage active engagement rather than passive reading, which might be difficult for some dyslexic students. And finally, for the R thing, I think reading will help focus attention and comprehension.
Yes,
Yeah,
very
well,
much so.
That's all I have so far.
Oh, that is really good. Thank you very much. I was actually processing what you were saying in myself. I'm like, oh, I should probably paraphrase this to my students when I next see them. So thank you very much for this. Great. And has Tahir put anything more in the chat, Benjamin?
Here we go. He said all the different methods give different perspective.
Indeed, very much so. It does give a different perspective in terms of processing information. Good. So in terms of my thoughts, some of my thoughts were that it could be an effective self-directed learning tool to coach dyslexic students in, because it's a structured approach. And most of the time when students are studying, you're like, oh my days, there's so many things that I could do to study, but what structure can I use? So this is actually a very good structured approach, which can be coachable and easily followed up, even with personal tutors or school teachers or even and colleagues to see that you're basically using it effectively, essentially, and it's beneficial in terms of skim reading. However, things to evaluate and consider is, could this be applied to all people, all subjects, sorry, because, for example, maths doesn't really have any reading. It basically has equations. So maybe that's the one subject which might, the PQRST method might be a bit difficult. And also, are these statistical benefits, are they something that you can carry on for years? Like, is it beneficial after years, or is it a more short-term effective thing as well? Great. So with that, before I basically ask you what you have learned for the session and take in for 2 minutes any questions from the audience, let's test one more time. And this time you'll all unmute and basically say it together as we go through the letters. So P is for?
Preview.
Yes. Q is for? Yep.
Questions.
Yep. R is for?
Read.
Yes. S is for?
Summarize.
Yes. T is for?
Test.
My days, you're all singing music to my ears. Like, forget Spotify. Other apps with music are available, but this music of PQRST was just beautiful to my auditory receptors. Brilliant. So for time, I will basically have accept any questions for 2 minutes that anyone has. So I'll stop share, so I'll be able to see if anyone has any questions for me. And you may raise your hand as well if you have any questions. Yes, Eleanor.
Hi, Mitchell.
Right.
I was just wondering, because obviously it's a study technique that students can use at home.
Mm-hmm.
And it'd be also good as an intervention in schools,
Mm.
in time-wise,
Mm-hmm.
because obviously in a school setting, when you have a section of text to read,
Mm-hmm.
a student without dyslexia could read it and get all the information they need from that.
Yes.
But I was just thinking when you were on about it that it'd be a very good method for students with dyslexia to actually engage with the work a lot better. So is there any like adaptations that can be made to it to make it useful in school settings?
I'm very happy you asked that question. Funnily enough, I don't know if this particular student is in the call today, but one school actually already implements the PQRST method into their school philosophy in terms of how they actually allow information to be delivered, in terms of sending them the material that essentially needs to be pre-read, then basically coming in with a pre-knowledge check test at the start of the lesson, before then teaching them the material, and then giving them a moment to make their own notes and summarize, and then end off with a mini test at the end of the lesson. So yes, I do think there are ways that it could be adapted in more schools. I think the main difficulty is that not enough schools have heard about this method in the first place to be able to go forth and implement it. But I do definitely feel like it could be something that could be transferable for schools to basically carry on. I hope that answered your question.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I'll just have time for one more question. Does anyone have another question? Yes, Bilal.
Yeah. I mean, my question is in regard to the test, the T in the end. Because, in our educational system, test is literally everywhere. Some system more than others, especially like, for example, France, or like, for example, I come from Algeria, like we had tests almost like every month. So my question is, how effective is testing students? Because, from experience, I've seen that tests can be, when you do it too much, it can be a problem with the stress. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, so it's really interesting you bring that up, because it therefore goes into the discussion of whether we should test students at all. Because if we basically do standardized testing, and the way we do standardized testing, it's always going to be at this moment built in a way that's going to always sort of disadvantage neurodivergent people in some shape or form. So it basically goes back to that very question of, should we test students at all? Should we be moving more to a portfolio-based assessment system rather than an actual standardized testing system? So that's basically my philosophical answer to your question, essentially. Again, I hope I've kind of answered your question, even though I feel I've left you with more questions than answers.
No, yeah, but because I kind of have the same idea that because tests has been like designed like more than 200 years ago, and the world has changed and people have changed, and in that sense, I'm pretty much on the same page as you.
Great, thank you very much. So thank you very much, everyone, for such illuminating discussions.